On March 15, 2009, Detroit police were dispatched to a disturbance at a local bar on the east side of the city. At 11:20 p.m., officers reported a fight in the parking lot involving several men. Among them was 45-year-old Jerome Whitfield, a lifelong Detroit resident who worked as a mechanic at a small repair shop. Whitfield was unmarried, lived alone in a rented apartment, and occasionally struggled with alcohol. Witnesses later stated that he had been drinking that evening and became involved in an argument that escalated into physical confrontation. When officers arrived, he was identified as one of the primary aggressors. At 11:40 p.m., Whitfield was booked at the precinct. According to the official intake report, he appeared intoxicated but cooperative. His personal property was inventoried, fingerprints taken, and he was placed in a holding cell. The shift log shows no record of medical issues or behavioral incidents between booking and the early morning hours. At 3:15 a.m. on March 16th, Detective Ray Cornelius contacted Whitfield's son Damon by telephone. Damon, then 19, and in his first year of law school, recalled Cornelius stating, "Your father fell down the stairs at the station and didn't survive." The message gave no further explanation. Damon went to the Wayne County morgue later that day to identify the body. The condition of the remains caused immediate doubt. Whitfield's face was heavily bruised, with fractures to the nose and orbital bones. Several ribs were broken on both sides of the chest. There were also dark marks on the wrists. Damon questioned whether these injuries could have resulted solely from a staircase fall. County Coroner Dr. Leonard Harris conducted the autopsy and listed the cause of death as accidental blunt force trauma from a fall. Harris, then 62, had served for decades in Wayne County and was regarded as authoritative. In his written opinion, the range of injuries was consistent with an uncontrolled fall from an elevated point and subsequent impact with steps and railing. Assistant Coroner Dr. Zane Madison, age 28, was present during the examination. Reviewing the body, he argued that the injuries appeared to indicate repeated impact rather than a single fall. He noted patterned bruising across the torso and what he considered restraint-like marks on both wrists. Madison documented these concerns in preliminary notes, but his comments were excluded from the final report. According to later records, he pressed Harris to consider non-accidental causes. Harris dismissed his objections, describing them as speculative. Madison continued to pursue the matter internally, leading to his removal from the case and eventual termination from the office in 2010 for what was described as insubordination. Damon pursued answers through administrative requests. He formally asked the police department to release surveillance recordings from the booking area and stairwell for the relevant hours. The response stated that the system had malfunctioned and that all recordings from the period were lost. When asked whether backup drives existed, the department stated they did not. Damon also sought access to shift reports and officer statements. The three officers on duty, Sergeant William Hanlon, Officer Richard Yates, and Officer Tommy McCrae, each filed reports that Whitfield, visibly intoxicated, attempted to move without assistance, stumbled, and fell down the stairs. The phrasing across all three statements was notably similar, though no supervisor flagged the issue. With these limitations, Damon turned to legal counsel. He contacted Cynthia Graham, a Detroit attorney known for representing clients in misconduct cases. Graham reviewed the autopsy report, officer statements, and correspondence. She explained that without physical evidence contradicting the fall narrative, the case would not hold in court. "A judge will dismiss this immediately," she told him, noting that testimony from a single assistant coroner already dismissed from the case would not outweigh the official report signed by Harris. This conclusion left Damon with few options. He lacked financial means to hire independent investigators and had little influence as a student. Nevertheless, he resolved to continue pursuing the matter in the long term. Later in 2009, he obtained an internship at Harrison Partners, a small Detroit private investigation firm specializing in employment disputes, insurance fraud, and occasional police-related misconduct cases. For Damon, the placement provided access to investigative methods, databases, and practitioners familiar with evidentiary standards. He began to study how misconduct cases were built, where weaknesses in official reports could be exposed, and how to track overlooked records. Although the official documents concluded that Jerome Whitfield died accidentally, Damon regarded the explanation as inadequate. For law enforcement, the file was closed, but for the Sun, the inconsistencies became the starting point of a long, personal investigation. The unanswered questions, the missing video, uniform police statements, and dismissal of a dissenting coroner ensured that the case would not fade from his attention. In November 2021, more than 12 years after the death of Jerome Whitfield, Detroit police responded to a call regarding a suspicious death inside an abandoned warehouse on the west side of the city. The body was identified as 51-year-old Tommy McCrae, a former police officer who had retired in 2015 after a disciplinary record that included multiple complaints of excessive force but no sustained findings. McCrae had been found lying face down with visible blunt force trauma. The preliminary autopsy revealed fractures to the ribs and injuries to the face. Near the body, investigators recovered a small children's hair clip, pink in color, engraved with the initials K.W. The item was catalogued and sent for analysis, though it appeared unrelated to McCrae himself, who had no daughters or granddaughters with those initials. At the time of discovery, detectives initially considered robbery or a targeted assault, but the presence of the hair clip introduced uncertainty. Crime scene photographs confirmed that the clip was positioned deliberately near the body rather than dropped at random. Detectives noted the similarity between McCrae's injuries and patterns recorded in prior cases involving baton strikes or repeated blunt impacts. 2 months later, in January 2022, another unusual death drew attention. Retiree Vince DeLuca, 67, died in a single-vehicle accident on a suburban road outside Detroit. His car had veered off the pavement and struck a tree. While at first categorized as accidental, a search of the vehicle revealed an object that complicated the case. In the glove compartment, officers discovered a high school graduation photo from 2009. One face, that of an African-American teenage girl, was marked with a red circle drawn in pen. Investigators could not establish why DeLuca, a retired maintenance worker with no children of his own, possessed the photograph. The photo was logged as evidence and compared against archived school records. Detectives reviewing both incidents noticed parallels. Items tied to 2009 appearing at 2 unrelated death scenes. This prompted them to revisit cases from that period. A background check on both McCrae and DeLuca revealed that each had professional or social contact with law enforcement in Detroit during 2009. McCrae was one of the officers on duty during the night Jerome Whitfield died. DeLuca, while not an officer, had been a contractor who occasionally performed maintenance work at police facilities and was known to socialize with some department staff. During this review, the name of Dr. Zane Madison resurfaced. Madison, formerly an assistant coroner, had been terminated in 2010 after repeated attempts to reopen the Whitfield case. Records showed that in 2009 he had argued internally that Whitfield's injuries were inconsistent with an accidental fall and requested a re-autopsy, a request denied by his superior. After leaving the medical examiner's office, Madison obtained work as a pathologist in private hospitals across Michigan. He maintained full access to medical records, autopsy data, and training in the mechanics of trauma. Detectives considered the possibility that Madison, with detailed knowledge of injury patterns, could have been involved in reproducing fatal injuries against targeted victims. This theory appeared to align with the conditions at the McCrae crime scene. When officers attempted to question Madison at his residence in early 2022, they found the property empty. Neighbors reported not seeing him for several days. Inside the house, investigators discovered a handwritten note left on a desk. The message read, "They killed an innocent man, and I will prove it." The note reinforced suspicions that Madison was acting in connection to past events surrounding Whitfield. However, the inclusion of the children's hair clip and the graduation photograph remained unexplained. Both items predated the current incidents by more than a decade and were not directly linked to Madison through existing records. Investigators were left with 2 pressing questions: how Madison had obtained personal objects from 2009, and why he chose to leave them deliberately at modern crime scenes. With Madison missing and no clear motive beyond the cryptic note, detectives launched a broader search. They reviewed his employment history, digital activity, and financial records. Early findings suggested no financial distress or sudden behavioral changes. Yet the pattern of deaths and symbolic evidence raised concerns of an organized effort tied to unresolved events from 2009. The investigation was formally reclassified as a potential serial case with historic connections, focusing on the possibility that Madison sought to demonstrate police misconduct through acts of retaliation. The official record for early 2022 closed with Madison listed as a fugitive person of interest. The working theory described him as a knowledgeable former coroner who could accurately simulate traumatic injuries, possibly targeting individuals linked to the night of Whitfield's death. Still, investigators noted the inconsistency. If Madison's intent was to expose corruption, the symbolic placement of children's items from 2009 required further explanation. The origins and meaning of those objects remained unresolved. As detectives expanded their review of 2009 cases connected to the deaths of Tommy McRae and Vince DeLuca, analysts in the department archives identified a file that had not drawn attention for years. It involved 17-year-old Kiara Washington, a Detroit high school student who, in February 2009, filed a formal complaint accusing 3 police officers of sexual assault. According to the original record, the complaint described an incident inside a precinct interrogation room. However, within 1 week, the case was closed. Washington formally withdrew the complaint, stating that the incident had been a misunderstanding. Internal Affairs marked the file as unfounded and removed it from active review. Investigators in 2022 regarded the timing as significant. The complaint had been filed only weeks before Jerome Whitfield's death. Furthermore, one of the named officers overlapped with staff, later linked to the March 15th incident. Detectives requested to re-examine the file, but much of the paperwork had been archived in incomplete form. Statements from the 3 accused officers were brief and near identical, and no medical documentation was included. Parallel inquiries uncovered further information. Journalists researching historical misconduct cases in Detroit discovered that Washington had died 3 years earlier in Chicago, in 2019, from an accidental drug overdose. At the time of her death, she was 26 years old and living in a transitional housing program. Her personal belongings, transferred to her assigned social worker Margaret Davis, included a handwritten diary that described past trauma. Margaret Davis, 48, had worked as a licensed social worker for over 2 decades. She confirmed to investigators that Washington gave her the diary before her death, with the instruction that it should be kept safe. The diary, spanning several years, contained detailed entries about the February 2009 incident. In those entries, Washington described being taken into an interrogation room by 3 uniformed officers, where she was raped. She wrote that during the assault she screamed for help. At that moment, a mechanic being held in the station, later identified as Jerome Whitfield, overheard the situation and forced his way into the room. According to the diary, Whitfield demanded that the officers release Washington and threatened to inform the prosecutor's office. Washington's account continued with descriptions of the officers striking Whitfield repeatedly with metal batons. She wrote that the blows continued after he fell, and that he eventually stopped moving. The officers then carried him toward the stairwell. Her entry stated, "The mechanic died protecting me, but his son will never know the truth, and I will live with this burden my whole life." The diary entries aligned with the injuries documented in Whitfield's autopsy, and with concerns originally raised by Assistant Coroner Zane Madison. For investigators, this was the first narrative connecting Whitfield's death to deliberate police action. Following this lead, detectives searched the abandoned residence of Madison, who had disappeared earlier in 2022. Inside, they found copies of multiple medical reports, including Whitfield's autopsy and other files relating to cases of blunt force trauma. In addition, investigators discovered handwritten notes outlining what appeared to be plans targeting specific individuals, including references to McRae and DeLuca. These documents suggested Madison had studied details of the Whitfield case extensively and had linked it to names associated with misconduct in 2009. However, a new question emerged. How had Madison gained access to Washington's private diary? Margaret Davis stated that she had never released the diary publicly and had not been in direct contact with Madison. Investigators theorized that a third party may have transferred the information, but no direct link could be established. The discovery of Washington's diary changed the direction of the investigation. The earlier theory that Madison's motive was vague retaliation now appeared grounded in a specific narrative, to expose that Whitfield was killed not by accident, but as a consequence of intervening in an assault. Yet the unexplained circulation of Washington's personal writings raised concerns about who else had access and how those documents had left Davis's possession. By mid-2022, detectives reclassified Madison not simply as a fugitive, but as a central figure attempting to publicize historical police misconduct through violent means. Still, they could not ignore the possibility that another person, with access to Washington's diary and her personal belongings, was either assisting Madison or manipulating evidence to direct suspicion toward him. In early March 2023, Detective Ray Cornelius received an anonymous message delivered through an encrypted email system. The text was brief. "Doctor, Madison didn't kill anyone. Today you will meet the son of the man you killed." The message specified a time and place, March 15, 2023, at a motel on the outskirts of Detroit. The date coincided with the 14th anniversary of Jerome Whitfield's death. Cornelius arrived at the location expecting to confront the fugitive coroner, Zane Madison, who had been the primary suspect for over a year. Instead, the person who entered the room was 33-year-old Damon Whitfield. Calm at first, Damon explained that Madison had in fact died of cancer in 2021. Before his death, Madison had shared with him all collected evidence regarding Jerome Whitfield's autopsy, internal documents, and personal research. According to Damon, Madison agreed that after his death, suspicion could fall on him, thereby protecting Damon while he pursued his own plan. Damon described how, following the failed legal challenge in 2009, he had completed his law degree but chosen not to practice as an attorney. Instead, he remained with the investigative agency Harris and Partners, later obtaining his private investigator license. This gave him legitimate access to databases and public records, including certain restricted police archives. Through his work, he developed networks with professionals, among them social worker Margaret Davis, who eventually entrusted him with Kiara Washington's diary. He admitted that the objects left at the 2021 and 2022 crime scenes, the children's hair clip marked KW, and the graduation photo, had been taken directly from Washington's belongings, which Davis had preserved after her death. Damon acknowledged planting these items to link the killings to past events while ensuring suspicion fell on Madison. His stated objective was to force investigators to reopen the circumstances of 2009. During the confrontation, Damon's composure collapsed. Referring directly to Washington's diary, he accused Cornelius of personal involvement in both the rape of Washington and the beating of his father. He shouted lines written in the diary, such as, "She recorded every blow you made. She remembered every word you said while killing my father." He proceeded to assault Cornelius, striking him repeatedly in ways consistent with the injuries documented in the Whitfield autopsy and described in the diary. Witness accounts later confirmed that Damon explicitly referred to passages in the diary while delivering each blow. He reenacted the sequence described by Washington: baton strikes to the torso, repeated impacts after the victim fell, and eventual trauma to the head. According to Damon, this methodical approach was intended to replicate the suffering his father endured. At the end of the assault, he pushed the severely injured Cornelius down a stairwell within the motel. When police units arrived in response to an emergency call, Damon was waiting without resistance. He reportedly stated, "Detective Cornelius fell down the stairs, just like my father 14 years ago." The remark was recorded in the arrest report. Cornelius was pronounced dead at the scene. During trial proceedings later that year, prosecutors charged Damon Whitfield with first-degree murder. Evidence introduced included surveillance from the motel, testimony from responding officers, and Damon's own statements at the scene. His defense counsel argued that his actions were motivated by a decade-long pursuit of justice and trauma linked to the loss of his father. However, the court determined that the killing was premeditated and carried out with intent. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The trial also brought renewed attention to the material Damon had revealed. Washington's diary, authenticated through handwriting analysis and corroborated by Davis, was entered into evidence. Alongside Madison's preserved documents, the diary provided a detailed account implicating multiple officers in sexual assault and in the staged killing of Jerome Whitfield.